I never planned to go back to my grandmother's cabin. The last time I'd been there, I was 16, visiting for the summer. That was 15 years ago. By now, the cabin in the woods of northern Maine had been abandoned for almost a decade, left to the slow decay of rain, snow, and wind. My grandmother, Ethel, had passed away quietly in her sleep many years earlier, and the property had been inherited by distant relatives who had no interest in it. Yet for some reason, last spring, I found myself driving the long, twisting dirt roads, surrounded by dense pine and birch forests, heading back there with my dog, Bear. Bear is a big German Shepherd mix, lean and strong, and loyal to the point of stubbornness. He had been with me through almost everything in my adult life, and I trusted him more than anyone else. He sat quietly in the passenger seat, ears twitching, tail occasionally thumping against the side of the car as we drove. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet, and the temperature had that sharp edge that made the coming night feel almost alive. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how overgrown everything had become. The driveway had almost disappeared under weeds and moss. The small wooden bridge over the creek that ran beside the property was rotting and cracked. The cabin itself, a modest structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, looked smaller than I remembered, but somehow more menacing. Windows were clouded with years of dust and grime. The wood darkened and weathered, some logs cracked and splintered. The front porch sagged in the middle, and the steps creaked dangerously under even the lightest weight. I parked the car and let Bear out. He immediately sniffed the air and began pacing, low growls rumbling in his throat. Something about the place didn't smell right. Not the usual scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, but something sharper, metallic, and sour. My stomach twisted with unease, but I tried to push it aside. I had come here to reclaim a part of my past, not to overthink old cabins. The front door was stiff. I had to shove it hard, leaning my shoulder against the wood until it finally gave with a groan that echoed through the still forest. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew, mold, and dust. Sunlight, already fading, filtered through cracked windows, casting pale beams that illuminated motes of floating dust. The furniture was covered with old sheets, moth-eaten and yellowed. The fireplace had long been unused, but ashes from years ago were scattered around. I turned on a flashlight I had brought and started exploring room by room. Bear stayed close, ears forward, nose twitching. The bedrooms were mostly empty, though a few pieces of my grandmother's old furniture remained, scratched and water-stained. On a shelf in the corner of the living room, I spotted some of her old porcelain figurines, covered in grime. The sight brought back memories of summers spent here, of my grandmother humming quietly while cooking, of the wood stove crackling in the corner. It wasn't until I entered the small storage room at the back of the cabin that I found it, the source of the smell that had gnawed at my stomach all along. My flashlight beam landed on a wooden crate that had been shoved into the corner, mostly hidden under a moth-eaten blanket. The metal latch was rusted, but I pried it open with my hands, the sound of metal scraping against metal echoing unnaturally in the silent cabin. Inside, there was a body. First, I couldn't believe it. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and the smell hit me full force. A mix of decay and ammonia that made my stomach churn violently. The body was that of a man, middle-aged, dressed in clothes that had once been dark but were now gray and faded. His face was partially obscured, but I could see his jawline, stiff and pale, eyes closed. His hands were crossed over his chest as if in sleep, but the stillness was wrong, unnatural. I stumbled backward, knocking over the flashlight and falling to the floor, gasping. Bear barked and growled, retreating a few steps but staying alert. The reality of the situation hit me slowly. Whoever this man had been, he had been left here for a long time, months, maybe even a year. The body wasn't hidden carefully. It had been shoved into the crate and abandoned. There was no sign of struggle in the cabin itself. No overturned furniture. No bloodstains on the floor. The floorboards had faint scratches near the crate, but nothing that told a clear story. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Could it have been a transient who had died here? Or someone my grandmother had encountered years ago? The questions spun like a storm, but I couldn't dwell on them. I had to act. I backed out of the cabin, Bear close behind me, shaking with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The forest outside was suddenly overwhelming, the dark trees closing in. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling, and called the local authorities. The call was brief, though they asked me to remain calm and stay outside the cabin. I couldn't stop pacing, watching Bear sniff the ground and whine softly, sensing my tension. Within an hour, the police arrived. 2 officers and a coroner stepped carefully through the broken driveway and into the cabin. They were calm, professional, but the way their eyes widened at the crate told me they understood the gravity of what I had found. I explained how I had come to the cabin, how I had discovered the body. They took over, securing the area, photographing everything, and eventually closing the crate again for transport. Bear stayed close, tail low but alert, refusing to leave my side. The investigation revealed what I had suspected. The man had likely died of natural causes, trapped somehow in the cabin or sheltering here during a winter storm. He had been isolated, unnoticed, probably for months. The coroner was careful to explain that there were no signs of foul play, no evidence of a crime beyond the unfortunate circumstances of isolation. My grandmother had been elderly and frail, living alone in this remote area, and while she had always been kind to wanderers and neighbors alike, there was no reason to believe she had anything to do with it. I stayed on the property for another day, watching as the body was removed and the cabin secured. The forest seemed quieter, less oppressive now that the situation had been addressed. Bear and I wandered the edge of the creek, listening to the soft rush of water over stones, the wind shaking the trees. I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow, not just for the man who had died alone, but for the cabin itself, left to decay, holding secrets I could never fully understand. Before leaving, I walked through the cabin one last time. The air smelled faintly of wood and damp earth, a memory of summers long gone. I touched the old wooden table in the center of the living room, remembering my grandmother chopping vegetables there, humming. I imagined her sitting in the corner, quietly watching me, and I felt a small, comforting sense of closure. The cabin was empty again, but at least now it wasn't hiding a body, and for the first time in years, it felt like I could leave without fear. Driving away, Bear leaning his head against my arm, I looked back at the narrow dirt road winding into the woods. The cabin, small and battered, faded into the shadows. I felt a deep respect for the quiet, indifferent power of the forest, for the way life and death intersect in places like this, far from the gaze of others. I knew I wouldn't be back soon, but the memory of that night stayed with me, clear and sharp, a reminder that even the places we think we know can hold secrets we are never truly prepared for. By the time we reached the paved road and the lights of the nearest town, the tension had eased. Bear stretched in the back seat, yawning, his fur soft under my hand. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what had happened begin to lift. The world outside the forest felt normal again, bright even, but the memory of the cabin, the body, and the long, quiet night in the woods would stay with me forever. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin I had rented just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. I was 32 back then, going through a rough patch in life after quitting my job and ending a long relationship. I just wanted quiet, space, somewhere away from traffic and phone calls and noise. The cabin was a single-floor wooden structure tucked deep into the Ponderosa Forest, about 20 miles from town. I found it listed online for cheap, too cheap probably, but I didn't care. I packed my old pickup truck with enough food, water, and fuel for the generator, and headed out on a cold Monday morning. The drive took longer than I thought. Once I left the highway, the dirt road wound through thick forest, the trees so tall they blocked most of the sunlight. By the time I reached the cabin, the air was already cooler, and the sky had a pale, heavy look that meant rain was coming. The place itself looked decent enough, small, with faded green paint peeling from the siding and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. There was a shed out back and a fire pit ringed with stones. I remember thinking it was peaceful, in that isolated kind of way where you start to notice every sound around you. Inside, the cabin smelled like pine and dust. The furniture was old but solid. A single bed, a table, a wood stove, and shelves filled with tools and canned food left behind by whoever owned it before. I unpacked my stuff, fed some logs into the stove, and started settling in. I had my dog with me, a German Shepherd mix named Toby. He was usually calm, but the moment we got inside, he started pacing near the windows, sniffing around and staring out into the trees. I figured he was just adjusting to new smells. That first day went by quietly. I chopped some firewood, cooked canned chili, and took a short walk through the trees before sunset. The forest felt endless, dark, still, and full of that dry, earthy smell that only pine woods have. As the sun dropped, everything turned silent except for the wind. Even the birds disappeared. That night, I lay on the bed listening to the fire pop and crackle in the stove. Toby slept near the door. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just strange. A low scraping noise, like something brushing against the wall outside. I sat up and listened. It stopped. I told myself it was just a branch swaying in the wind. But then Toby started growling, a low rumble deep in his throat. I reached over to calm him, and he just kept staring at the front door, his fur raised. I didn't sleep much after that. Around 3 a.m., I heard another sound. A short, sharp noise, like something stepping on the porch boards. Then silence again. I stayed still, my heart hammering, every small creak of the cabin making me tense up. Eventually, the noises stopped, and the forest went dead quiet again. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was soft from the rain during the night, and I noticed faint prints around the cabin. They were strange, longer than a man's foot, but the shape wasn't right. It looked almost like a barefoot human print, except the toes were spaced wider apart, and the heel seemed off, like whoever made it had walked on the edge of their foot. I crouched there for a long time just staring at them, trying to figure it out. Maybe someone had been trespassing, or maybe some animal, but I couldn't match the shape to anything I knew. The rest of that day felt off. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. Toby kept sticking close to me, ears perked up, eyes scanning the tree line. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I decided to stay up later, just to see if I heard anything again. I turned off the lanterns around midnight and sat by the window with the rifle I kept in the cabin. The forest outside was black and heavy. No wind, no sounds. I waited for what felt like hours. Then I saw something. It was faint at first, just movement between the trees. A shape, tall and thin, walking slowly near the tree line about 30 yards out. My eyes strained to focus. It looked like a person, but the way it moved didn't look right. Its arms hung longer than normal, and its steps were uneven, almost dragging. I froze, barely breathing. The shape stopped behind a tree, then nothing. I stayed at the window for almost half an hour, but it didn't move again. When I finally stepped outside, everything was still. The air was cold enough to see my breath. I could hear my own heartbeat. I walked slowly toward where I thought I'd seen it, Toby trailing behind me, ears pinned back. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, showing only wet pine needles and empty space. Then I found more prints. The same strange, stretched footprints, fresh in the mud. They led away into the trees and vanished where the ground turned rocky. I barely slept that night. By the next morning, I'd made up my mind to leave early. I didn't want to spend another night there. I started packing my things, but around noon, I realized the spare gas can I'd left near the shed was gone. It had been full. I checked around the area, thinking maybe I misplaced it. That's when I noticed the back door of the shed was open. I hadn't opened it before. Inside, it smelled awful, like rotting meat. There were old traps, rusted tools, and in one corner, animal bones. Some looked small, like rabbits, but others were too big. I found my gas can sitting there, half empty, as if someone had just taken it and put it back. I felt sick looking at those bones. I grabbed the can, slammed the shed door shut, and locked it with the rusted latch. That evening, as the sun went down, I built a fire outside and sat near it with Toby. I kept the rifle next to me. The forest was dead quiet again, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. Then Toby started whining, staring into the trees. I looked up and saw it again, this time closer. A tall, thin figure standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, still as stone. I could see enough to tell it was wearing something like torn clothing, and its skin looked pale, stretched tight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. I could only see the shape of its face, a long jaw too narrow. I stood up slowly, my whole body trembling. The fire cracked loudly, and in that moment, it slipped backward into the dark, fast and silent. I didn't chase it. I just grabbed Toby, went inside, and locked the door. I stayed awake until dawn, every sound making my heart pound. I could hear faint movements outside, branches breaking, footsteps circling. Once, I thought I heard breathing by the window. When morning came, I packed everything I could fit into the truck, started it, and didn't look back. The road out was rough, the trees closing in on both sides. About 5 miles down, I passed a small clearing, and there, on the side of the road, was something that made my stomach twist. A deer carcass, torn open, the legs bent at odd angles. The skin was missing from most of its head. It looked like something had peeled it clean. By the time I reached town, the sunlight felt unreal, too bright. I stopped at a gas station and sat there for almost half an hour trying to calm down. I didn't tell anyone what I saw because I didn't even know how to explain it. Weeks later, after I was back home, I looked up stories about strange sightings in northern Arizona. There were mentions of tall, human-like shapes in the woods, people hearing footsteps around their cabins at night. Stories passed quietly between hunters and locals. Some called them skinwalkers, something old from Navajo legends, but I didn't believe in legends. I still don't. What I do believe is what I saw. Whatever it wasn't a ghost or some myth. It was real, physical, and out there. I sometimes wonder if it was a person, someone twisted by the wild, living off things they shouldn't. I'll never know. I never went back to that cabin again. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still picture that figure standing just outside the light, silent, patient, watching. And I can still hear the sound of those footsteps moving slowly around the cabin walls, as if it knew I was inside. It was October of 2014 when I got assigned to work as a seasonal park ranger in a remote area of northern Montana. The park was known for its long hiking trails, dense forests, and quiet lakes that barely saw visitors after summer ended. I was 29 at the time, still fairly new to the job, eager to prove I could handle long nights in isolation. The ranger station I was given sat deep in the woods, around 12 miles from the nearest paved road. It wasn't much. A small one-room cabin with a metal roof, a desk, a narrow bed, a propane heater, and a shortwave radio that barely worked half the time. I arrived in late afternoon, the air already turning cold. The dirt road that led there was muddy and covered with pine needles. I remember how the tires slid a little as I drove up the final hill, trees pressing close on both sides, their branches wet and heavy from rain earlier that morning. When I finally stopped in front of the cabin, I just sat for a minute, looking at it. It looked older than the reports made it sound. Paint chipped, logs dark from years of rain, and a faint lean to the left like it had settled too much on one side. Inside smelled of old wood and fuel. A small generator was sitting out back, half buried in leaves, with a jerry can next to it. I unpacked, stored some food, checked the propane tank, and made sure the emergency supplies were still sealed. Everything looked fine at first glance. There was an old calendar hanging by the door from 2009, with a few notes scribbled in pencil, mostly dates marked with words like inspection or trail check. The last mark was in September of that year, then nothing. It was as if someone had just stopped showing up. By evening, the rain started again. Light at first, then heavier as darkness came in. The sound of it hitting the metal roof was almost soothing. I wrote up a short report on the conditions and radioed it to the main station. Static mostly, but a faint confirmation came through, and that was that. After that, it was just me and the forest. The first few nights went smoothly. I got used to the silence, the smell of damp earth, the sound of distant thunder rolling through the mountains. Every morning I'd check the nearby trails, record any damage or signs of animals, then return before dark. One night, about a week in, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't rain. It was a short, sharp metallic clank. I lay there, half awake, thinking maybe the wind had knocked something over. But then it happened again, more faint this time, like metal against metal. I got up, put on my boots, and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground soft and slick. The air felt colder, heavier. I used my flashlight to scan the area. The beam caught fog drifting low across the clearing, the generator, the old wooden shed behind the cabin. Everything looked still. I walked around slowly, checking for loose chains or tools left out. Nothing. But as I circled back, I noticed fresh boot prints in the mud near the shed. They weren't mine. They were larger and deeper, as if someone heavier had been standing there for a while. They led up toward the tree line, then vanished into the grass and pine needles. I followed them a few feet, but the fog thickened fast, and the light from my flashlight began to fade into gray. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat for a long time listening. The rest of the night stayed quiet, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next day, I found the prints again, fainter now, but definitely human. I checked the shed, thinking maybe a hunter or hiker had wandered through. But inside was only a stack of rusted tools and an old chainsaw missing its blade. I made a note in my report and kept going. Still, the thought of someone walking around that close in the night bothered me more than I wanted to admit. By the second week, things started to feel off in small ways. The radio cut out more often. The generator stuttered. My food cans, which I kept in a sealed box under the counter, were moved slightly. Not much, but enough to notice. Once, I found the box lid half open. I told myself it was just me. Maybe I'd been tired and forgot to close it all the way. But something in me didn't buy that. On the 12th night, the wind picked up. It was around 1 a.m. The cabin creaking in the gusts, branches scraping against the roof. I just drifted off when I heard a sound that snapped me fully awake. Slow, heavy footsteps outside, close to the porch. I could hear them through the wall. Not an animal. Too steady, too deliberate. Then, a soft thud on the porch, like someone setting something down. I didn't move. I just sat up, barely breathing, listening. The steps moved toward the window, then stopped. For a long minute, nothing. Then the faint sound of movement again, this time farther off, moving into the trees. I stayed awake until daylight, staring at the window, waiting for the first bit of gray morning light to show. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was wet from the night's rain. On the porch, right beside the steps, was a small metal thermos. It wasn't mine. The paint was scratched off, but I could see faded lettering. Something about Montana Forestry Service. I picked it up, unscrewed the cap, and the smell hit me immediately. It was old coffee. Not fresh, not even recent. Just that sour, stale smell that clings to metal. I set it down and felt my stomach tighten. Later, I checked old ranger logs in the binder I found under the desk. One entry from years earlier mentioned a ranger named Davis who worked that same post. The last entry under his name said, "Final shift, September 27th, 09. Nothing after that. I didn't know what happened to him, but the thermos looked like something from that time. Maybe someone found old supplies and left them there. Maybe a hunter picked it up somewhere. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Over the next few days, I started hearing faint noises at night again. Soft crunching steps, branches snapping. Always distant, never close enough to see anything. I barely slept. My nerves were wearing thin, and I began counting the days until my rotation was over. One afternoon, I hiked up toward the ridge to check trail markers. As I climbed higher, I noticed a faint path that wasn't on any of the maps. Overgrown but still there. Curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. About half a mile in, I found what looked like the remains of another cabin. Just the stone foundation and a few collapsed beams left. It must have burned down long ago. Nearby was a metal folding chair, rusted through, half buried in dirt. And sitting next to it was another thermos. Same style, same faded letters. That night, I couldn't focus on anything else. The generator sputtered out before midnight, leaving the cabin dark. I sat there with my flashlight on, listening to the forest breathe around me. I started hearing faint movement again, this time closer, circling. Not fast, not panicked, just steady, like whoever it was knew I was inside and didn't care. I gripped my flashlight so tight my hand hurt. Around 3 a.m., something brushed the wall outside. A soft dragging sound, like fabric against wood. Then silence. I didn't move until dawn. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside, shaking from exhaustion. Around the back wall of the cabin, I found a long smear of mud running shoulder-high along the logs, and next to it, a clear handprint, large, smeared with wet soil. Whoever it was had been right there, only inches from where I slept. That morning, I packed everything I could fit into the truck. I didn't even bother logging the details over the radio. The static was bad anyway, and I just wanted out. I drove 12 miles back to the main road without stopping once. When I finally reached the ranger station and turned in my report, the supervisor just looked at me, then said someone else had been assigned to that same post a few years ago and had left after a week, refusing to go back. He didn't say why, and I didn't ask. I never went back to that cabin again. But sometimes, when it's raining at night, I still think about that handprint on the wall. The way it looked like whoever left it had leaned in close, just standing there in the dark, listening. It was early October of 1994 when I decided to drive out into the mountains of northern Washington. I was 29 then, still working construction jobs off and on, and I had this stubborn idea that I wanted to build my own small cabin. Something quiet, far from the noise of the city. I'd bought a narrow piece of cheap land off a logging road that no one really used anymore. It was overgrown and sloped down into a thick patch of pine and alder trees. The soil was damp and smelled like rot, but I liked that smell. It reminded me of working outdoors, of sweat and sawdust and wet bark. That week had been dry until the day I went up there. The sky had been pale and heavy, and by the time I'd parked my old Ford by the treeline, the first drops had started falling. I figured it wouldn't last long. I'd built in worse weather before, so I didn't think much of it. I had a small tarp, a chainsaw, some planks, and my old hand tools in the truck bed. I planned to build a small one-room cabin, just big enough for a cot, a stove, and a table. The rain came harder as I started cutting down a few dead pines. The air turned cold fast, and my hands were slick with mud and water. The noise of the chainsaw mixed with the sound of the rain until it was hard to tell which was louder. Every few minutes, I stopped to wipe my face and look at the tree line. The woods looked darker than usual, the kind of darkness that feels heavy, where you can't tell where the trunks end and the shadows begin. The smell of wet soil and pine needles was thick in the air. By evening, I had the foundation set. It wasn't much, just a rectangle of rough-cut logs laid into the mud, but it felt like progress. My clothes were soaked, and I hadn't eaten since morning. I decided to stay the night in the truck. I'd done that plenty of times before, so it didn't bother me. I covered the tools with the tarp, threw my sleeping bag in the back seat, and leaned the seat back. The rain hadn't let up. It just got steadier, more rhythmic. The sound of it on the metal roof felt almost calming at first. But sometime around midnight, I woke up. The sound had changed. It wasn't steady anymore. It came in bursts, like something brushing against the side of the truck. The kind of sound that makes your stomach tighten even before your brain catches up. I sat up and looked out through the fogged window. I couldn't see much except my own reflection and streaks of water running down the glass. I waited, listening. For a while, there was nothing except the rain again, tapping against the roof. Then I heard it again, this dragging noise, faint but close. It sounded like something scraping along the ground, slow and uneven. My first thought was that a branch had come loose and was dragging in the wind. But there wasn't much wind. I cracked the door open and stepped out into the cold air. The rain hit me like a sheet of needles. My flashlight beam caught the glint of wet mud, puddles, and the dark outline of the half-built foundation. Nothing else. I walked around the truck once, checking the tarp and tools. Everything was where I left it. But when I turned toward the edge of the woods, I noticed something odd. The ground was disturbed, small prints in the mud. Not boots, not animal prints. Just shallow marks, narrow, like someone had been standing barefoot in the wet dirt. There were a few of them, maybe half a dozen, leading toward the trees. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone from the old logging camp had wandered through. But it didn't make sense. Who'd be barefoot out here, in this cold, in the middle of the night? I went back to the truck, locked the doors, and sat awake for a long time, watching the rain pour down the windshield. My stomach felt tight, and my chest had that heavy, uneven feeling that comes when something's wrong but you can't name it yet. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, the rain had turned to a steady drizzle. The air was gray, heavy, and still. I got out, checked the tracks again, and found that most of them were washed out. The ground was soft and messy, but I could still make out the faint shapes where the mud had been pressed down. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that maybe I'd imagined them being human. I kept building. I cut more boards, drove nails, set up the frame. My hands worked automatically, but my head stayed half-turned toward the trees most of the time. Every sound made me stop. The snap of a branch, the rustle of water dripping from leaves, even the far-off echo of something that could have been an animal. By evening, I had the walls halfway up. I felt proud but exhausted. The rain picked up again, heavier this time. I decided to finish a few more boards before heading back to the truck. The light was fading fast, the kind of dim blue that comes just before dark. I was hammering the last nail when I saw movement near the edge of the clearing. just a small flicker, like something ducking behind a tree. My hammer paused midair. The woods went silent for a few seconds, except for the rain. I felt the hairs on my neck rise, that instinctive tightness again. I stood there staring, barely breathing, waiting for another movement. But nothing came. When it finally got dark, I went back to the truck. The inside smelled like wet clothes and stale coffee. I didn't bother turning on the radio. I just sat there in the dark, watching the rain hit the windshield again. I kept telling myself I was being stupid. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling that I wasn't alone. Sometime during the night, I woke again. This time, it wasn't a scraping sound. It was footsteps, slow, steady, moving around the truck. I didn't move. I just lay there, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps circled once, then stopped near the back. I could hear the soft patter of rain hitting something that wasn't metal, cloth maybe, or skin. The window fogged from my breath as I tried not to move. Then, after what felt like minutes, the sound faded. Just the rain again. I stayed awake until dawn. When the light finally came, I stepped out with the flashlight still in my hand even though I didn't need it. The ground behind the truck was covered in new prints. Clear this time because the rain had slowed during the night. They were human, barefoot. I counted at least 10 of them, leading off into the woods. The mud was pressed deep like whoever it was had been standing there for a while. I looked around the clearing, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The forest was silent, soaked, and gray. I packed up what I could, covered the unfinished frame with the tarp, and left. I didn't run, but I walked fast. The drive back down the mountain road was quiet, except for the sound of the tires splashing through puddles. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I told myself I'd come back once the weather cleared, but deep down I already knew I wouldn't. 2 weeks later, I went back mostly because I had to. I'd left some of my tools there, expensive ones. The sky was clear this time, the air dry and cold. When I got to the site, the tarp was gone. The frame was still standing, but the boards were warped from rain. My tools were scattered, half buried in the mud. And there were prints again, older now, but the same kind. Bare feet, small, almost child-sized, leading from the edge of the foundation toward the woods. I didn't bother following them. I just loaded what I could into the truck and left. I sold the land that winter to a man who said he wanted to build a hunting cabin. I never went back after that. Sometimes, when it rains hard at night and I can hear it hitting the roof in the same rhythm as that night, I still picture those footprints, those shallow, narrow shapes pressed into the mud. I don't know who or what they belong to, and I don't really want to. All I know is that I never finished that cabin, and I never tried building one again. It had been almost 9 years since I'd last driven down that narrow gravel road that led to the cabin. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter the deeper I went, the tires crunching over stones that had shifted and settled over the years. The trees leaned in closer now, like they'd grown thicker just to hide that place from anyone who didn't belong there. The sky was heavy with low, gray clouds, and the air had that damp, metallic smell that comes before rain. I could feel the pressure building in my chest the closer I got, a quiet, steady tightening that I tried to ignore. The cabin had once been my ex-husband's idea of peace. It was built by his grandfather sometime in the 60s, tucked deep in the woods near the back edge of old logging land outside of Missoula, Montana. Back then, he used to talk about it like it was a second home, a place to clear his head, to hunt, to get away from the noise of everything. For me, it was always the opposite. That cabin carried a silence that never felt calm. It was too still, too far from anything else. When I left him in 2016, I swore I'd never go back there again. But now he was dead. He'd been found 2 weeks ago, inside that same cabin. They said it looked like he'd been there for days before someone found him. No foul play, just an accident, maybe a fall or something else. He was only 47. The police didn't give many details, and I didn't ask for any. I didn't even plan to come at first. But when they called and said his things were still there, that someone needed to clear them out, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe it was guilt or curiosity or the part of me that never got closure. Whatever it was, I ended up on that road again with a plastic bag of cleaning supplies and a dull headache that wouldn't go away. By the time I pulled up, the rain had started. It came down slow and steady, soaking the trees and turning the dirt into a slick brown mess. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, the roof sagging a little in the middle, the wood darker, almost black with years of moisture. One of the shutters hung loose, banging against the wall in the wind. I sat in the car for a while, just staring at it. My heart was beating too fast for a place that was supposed to be empty. When I finally stepped out, the cold hit me right away. I walked up the narrow path, boots sinking into the mud, and stopped by the front door. The lock had been changed years ago, but the deputy had left a key in the mailbox for me. It turned stiffly, and when the door opened, a wave of stale, heavy air rolled out. The smell of rot, old smoke, and something faintly metallic. Inside, everything looked frozen in time. The same wood stove sat in the corner, a layer of ash still inside. The same threadbare couch. The same rug I'd hated, now darker with stains I didn't want to look at too closely. His boots were still by the door, caked in mud, and a flannel jacket was draped over the back of a chair. The small table by the window was covered in papers, receipts, and an empty whiskey bottle. I moved slowly, trying to take everything in. It felt wrong being there, like I was walking into someone else's private moment. The silence pressed on me again, thicker than I remembered. I could hear the rain tapping the roof and the occasional creak of wood shifting. I found myself staring at the floorboards where the stain near the kitchen still was, the one from when he dropped a pan of oil years ago. Funny how some marks never really went away. The main bedroom door was open halfway. The deputy had told me that's where they found him. I hesitated before stepping closer. The bed was unmade, the blankets tossed aside, a shirt crumpled on the floor. On the small nightstand was a half-empty bottle of painkillers and a glass of water gone cloudy with dust. I stood there for a while, looking at the indentation on the mattress. Faint but still there, like his weight had left a memory in the fabric. It hit me harder than I expected. All the anger I'd carried for years didn't mean much in that room. We'd spent so much time fighting, breaking each other down piece by piece, that I forgot there had been quiet moments too. Nights sitting by that stove, mornings when the light came through the trees just right. It all came back too easily, too painfully. I decided to start cleaning to distract myself. I went through the drawers, folded the clothes, and stacked what was worth keeping into a box. Most of it smelled like damp wood and cigarettes. In one drawer, I found a small photo. The two of us from maybe 15 years ago, standing by the lake, both sunburnt and smiling. I stared at it for a long time before tucking it back where I found it. When I got to the back room, the one he used as a storage space, I noticed the floor had water damage. The boards were warped near the window, and the air felt heavier, like there wasn't enough oxygen. I opened the window to let in some air, but the rain blew straight inside. I could see faint footprints in the dust, leading from the window to the door and back again. They looked too clean to be old. I tried to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. The hours dragged on, and the rain kept falling. I packed boxes, cleaned dishes that hadn't been washed in months, and bagged trash until the cabin looked less like his and more like something empty again. Around dusk, the light started to fade, and everything inside took on that dull blue tone that made it hard to tell what was shadow and what wasn't. I decided to stay a little longer, just to make sure I'd finished everything. But as the wind picked up outside, something started tapping against the side of the house. A steady, uneven rhythm. At first I thought it was the loose shutter, but when I went to check, the sound was coming from the back wall instead, the one near the bedroom. I stepped outside, pulling my jacket tighter, and walked around the side of the cabin. The rain had turned into a mist, and the ground was soft under my boots. When I reached the back, I saw what was making the sound. A branch had fallen and was scraping against the siding with every gust of wind. I pushed it away, but when I looked down, I noticed fresh mud near the base of the wall, like someone had walked there recently. The prints were deep, uneven, leading toward the woods. For a second, I thought maybe it was the deputy or a hunter passing through, but there hadn't been any other cars on the road. I followed the prints for a few feet until the trees swallowed them up. The forest was dark, quiet except for the rain dripping from the leaves. Something about it felt wrong, like I was being watched from somewhere just beyond the line of trees. I turned back to the cabin. The sight of it, dim light glowing through the window, the old wood wet and dark, filled me with an unease I couldn't shake. I didn't want to stay any longer. I went inside, locked the door, and sat down for a moment to catch my breath. My hands were trembling, though I wasn't sure why. As I sat there, I noticed something small I hadn't seen before. Near the corner of the table, there was a folded piece of paper tucked under the whiskey bottle. It had my name written on it, just my first name written in his sharp, familiar handwriting. My chest tightened. I opened it slowly. It wasn't a letter, just a few words scribbled unevenly. Didn't want to be alone. That was it. Nothing else. For a long time, I just stared at those words. There was no explanation, no apology, no hidden message. Just that simple line that carried more weight than anything he'd ever said when he was alive. Maybe he had known something was wrong. Maybe he had come there to end things quietly, in the one place that had always been his escape. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. Then I turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked back to the car. The rain had stopped by then, but the air was cold, sharp with the smell of pine and wet soil. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The cabin grew smaller until it was just a dark shape swallowed by trees. I thought about that note the whole way home, about how much it said without really saying anything at all. By the time I reached the main road, the sun had started to rise through the clouds, pale and weak but steady. I realized then that I didn't need to go back again. Whatever piece of him had been left in that cabin was gone now. What stayed behind was just the shell of what used to be, a place that had held both our best and worst moments. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally let it go. I hadn't planned to stay the night at the cabin. It was an old, weather-beaten building my uncle had left to me when he passed, and I hadn't even been sure I wanted to keep it. But that October, after a long week in the city and a quiet breakup that left me feeling hollow, I decided to escape. I drove out into northern Maine, a place I had barely visited before, where the trees were tall, the roads were narrow, and the wind carried the sharp scent of pine and wet leaves. I wanted quiet. I wanted isolation. I thought I wanted peace. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt path, tucked between two dense stands of pine. The paint had long since faded, leaving the wood gray and rough. Moss crept along the roof and the edges of the windows, and a single stone chimney jutted out like a crooked finger. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but I had a key. I had my backpack, my flashlight, and my dog. Max was a large mutt with a thick, wiry coat. He had been my companion for years, and I knew he would alert me to anything I couldn't see. The first thing I noticed as I opened the door was the smell. Old wood, dampness, and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. I stepped inside slowly, Max sniffing around my feet. Dust floated in the air in thin shafts from the small windows. The cabin had a single large room, a fireplace at one end, and a narrow stairway leading to a loft. The floorboards creaked under every step. I set my backpack down and opened the windows. The wind rustled the trees outside, and I felt the first real chill of the evening creep in. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me since I'd parked the car. I told myself it was the isolation, the silence that came from being so far from any road or neighbor. It wasn't fear, it was just awareness. I lit a small fire in the fireplace. The flames threw shadows across the walls, and Max curled up near my feet. I unpacked my bag. A blanket, a thermos of soup, a notebook, a pen. I wanted to write, to distract myself from the emptiness I felt inside. But I couldn't focus. The cabin was too quiet, too large, too full of small noises that seemed amplified. The wind tapping on the roof, the soft whistle of air through the cracks in the walls, Max's claws against the floorboards. I went upstairs to the loft to set up a sleeping area. The stairs groaned under my weight, and when I reached the loft, I realized how little light there was. I could just make out the rough wooden beams, the thick dust, and cobwebs in the corners. I unrolled my blanket and sat for a while, looking down at the room below. The shadows flickered from the fire. I tried to remind myself that I had chosen this, that I was safe, that nothing could happen. Then I noticed it. Something was off. Max had stopped moving. He wasn't curled up at my feet anymore. I called his name softly. Nothing. I took a cautious step toward the edge of the loft and looked down. Max was standing in the middle of the floor, ears pointed, body stiff. He was staring at the far corner of the cabin, near the fireplace. I froze. I didn't see anything at first, just shadows, the fire, the normal decay of the cabin. But then I noticed the smell. Metallic, sharper this time, like iron. My heart began to pound. I climbed down slowly, every step careful. Max followed my movement but didn't relax. When I reached the floor, I understood. Near the back of the fireplace, a section of the wooden wall looked darker than the rest. Upon closer inspection, I realized it was damp. Fresh damp. I crouched down and touched it. My fingers came back sticky, coated in something thick and dark. Blood. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. The sound of the wind seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the thumping of my heart and Max's low growl. I knew then that this cabin had not been as abandoned as I thought. Someone or something had been here recently. The thought should have made me panic, but strangely, I felt a grim clarity. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I moved, before I called anyone. I circled the room, looking for more clues. Every floorboard I stepped on groaned under my weight. Behind the kitchen counter, under the sink, I found more stains. They were smeared, as if someone had tried to clean up. I pulled my flashlight out of my backpack, shining it over every corner. Behind the stove, the stains were heavier, more concentrated. The smell was overpowering now. I realized what had probably happened. Someone had been injured here, someone badly, and then I thought of my uncle. He had lived alone. Could it have been him? But he had been gone for years. My mind spun. This wasn't a ghost story, this wasn't imagination. This was real. I went to the loft again. Max followed, but he was tense, scratching at the floor. I decided I had to inspect the attic. The stairs up were narrow and the ceiling low, but I climbed anyway. In the far corner, behind old boxes and tarps, I found a hatch. I lifted it. A narrow crawl space led into darkness. My flashlight barely penetrated it. And there it was, a body, not fresh, but not fully decomposed either. A man curled up, thin, pale, clothes tattered. He was alive, barely shivering. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and called 911 from my phone, speaking quickly into the line, giving the address as clearly as I could. Max barked at me incessantly as the man tried to mumble something. I gave him my water bottle. His eyes were terrified, blank, confused. The ambulance came faster than I expected. 2 paramedics carried the man out, one checking his vitals while the other covered him with a blanket. I stayed outside, shivering, the wind biting at my skin, Max close to me. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The cabin, the isolation, the smell, the blood. I had thought I was alone with only old wood and dust, but there had been someone there, surviving in the shadows, in the corner of the fireplace, barely alive. The police came afterward. They inspected the cabin, questioning me while Max stayed close, eyes darting around. The man had apparently been living there for weeks, hiding from someone or something. They didn't give me details, only that he was safe now in the hospital. I spent that night in the car, parked near the cabin, wrapped in blankets with Max at my side. The wind howled through the trees, but it didn't scare me anymore. I knew what real fear felt like. Not the silence, not the shadows, but the sudden, immediate presence of life and death so close. By morning, the first light filtered through the trees, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. I walked back to the cabin, saw the paramedics leaving with stretchers and equipment, and realized I had done the right thing by being there, by noticing, by acting. The cabin was still old and weathered, still smelling of damp wood and decay, but it was no longer empty, and the danger had passed. I didn't stay long after that. I returned home, changed the locks, and kept Max close. But I remembered every detail: the smell, the blood, the stiffness of the floorboards, the way shadows moved across the walls. And I remembered the man, alive because I had been cautious, because I had paid attention. That cabin would never feel empty to me again, and I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or legends. They're real, and they are waiting in plain sight. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to spend a weekend alone at the old cabin near the lake outside of Marlow, a small town about 4 hours from where I lived. The air had just started to cool, and the leaves were turning into those deep red and burnt orange shades that always made the forest feel older than it was. I brought my dog, Cooper, a 5-year-old mixed breed who never liked strangers but loved the woods. The plan was simple: get away from everything, clear my head, and finish a few sketches I'd been putting off for weeks. The cabin wasn't new. It was something my late uncle had built back in the 1980s, a small wooden place with a tin roof, no internet, no phone signal, and just enough electricity to keep a small heater running. It sat at the edge of a dense pine forest, about half a mile from the lake. A single dirt road curved through the trees to reach it. You couldn't see another house from there, which I used to like. By the time Cooper and I arrived, the sun was already sliding down behind the treeline. The forest looked heavy, the shadows longer than they should have been. The air had that damp, earthy smell of wet leaves and pine sap. I parked the truck right beside the cabin, unloaded my things, and started setting up inside. The place smelled faintly of wood smoke and old blankets. There was dust on everything, but it felt familiar. The same old kettle on the stove, the stack of firewood by the wall, and the rusted lantern hanging by the door. After unpacking, I fed Cooper and made a small fire in the old stove. The sound of the crackling would fill the silence in a comforting way. Cooper lay down near the door, his head resting on his paws, staring toward the window that looked out into the trees. I remember noticing how still the forest was. No wind, no crickets, not even the faint sound of the lake, just quiet. Later that night, I stepped outside with a flashlight to check around the cabin before locking up. The beam of light cut through the darkness and caught the fog rising low off the ground. The forest always looked different at night, deeper, almost endless. Cooper followed me halfway out the door but stopped suddenly. His ears pricked up. I thought maybe he heard an animal out there, but I didn't see or hear anything. The flashlight barely reached the treeline, just shapes and dark trunks fading into black. I went back inside, but Cooper wouldn't settle after that. He kept lifting his head, staring toward the back window, his ears twitching. I figured maybe it was a deer moving nearby. Around midnight, the sound started. A slow crunching outside, like someone stepping on the damp leaves behind the cabin. Cooper stood up immediately, low growl deep in his throat. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The steps were spaced out, not quick like an animal, just steady, measured steps. Then silence again. I waited for a while, standing near the door, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, the sound faded, and I sat back down near the fire. Cooper didn't lie down again, though. He stayed alert, eyes fixed on the window until I finally turned off the lantern and went to bed. I woke up sometime after 3 a.m. to Cooper barking. Not the playful kind, the sharp, deep bark he used when he felt threatened. I sat up fast, heart pounding, listening hard. He was standing at the window near the foot of the bed, tail straight, barking toward the trees behind the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it out through the glass, but all I saw was fog. Thick, rolling fog that made it impossible to tell how far it went. The flashlight beam hit the reflection of my own face more than the woods. The barking went on for a while until I got up and walked him to the door. When I cracked it open, the cold air hit my face, and I heard something. Faint but clear, branches breaking somewhere off to the left. Not close, but not far either. Cooper growled again, low and constant. I didn't step outside that time. I just locked the door again, pulled the curtains, and sat awake until morning. By dawn, everything looked harmless again. The fog was gone, sunlight spilling through the trees, and the air smelled clean. It almost made me feel stupid for getting so wound up. I took Cooper out for a walk around the back of the cabin to check things out. The ground was wet, and I could see a few sets of footprints near the edge of the trees, boot prints. Too big to be mine. They looked fresh, pressed deep into the mud like someone had been standing there for a while. There were at least 2 different sizes, one larger, one smaller, both leading away toward the forest. I remember feeling this cold, sinking feeling in my stomach. I followed the prints for about 20 feet before they just disappeared where the ground turned dry again. Cooper sniffed around, tail low, but didn't bark. I didn't go any farther. The rest of the day, I tried to distract myself with little things. Fixing a loose board on the porch, gathering wood, sketching near the window, but I kept catching myself glancing at the tree line. Around evening, when the light started to dim again, I noticed something else. A shape hanging on the fence post by the back corner of the cabin. I walked closer and realized it was a piece of torn fabric, maybe from a jacket. It was wet, dirty, and snagged on the wire like someone had brushed against it hard. That made my skin crawl a little. I didn't remember seeing it earlier. That night, I didn't light the stove. I wanted less light showing through the windows. I sat in the dark with Cooper next to me, just listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, circling the cabin this time. Not heavy, just deliberate. The wood of the porch creaked once. Cooper started growling, pacing from the front door to the back. My hands were shaking, but I grabbed the old hunting knife from the drawer and kept it near. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then faded into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. The air was colder, the sky gray and dull, and everything around the cabin looked damp and tired. I packed quickly while Cooper watched the window. When I stepped outside, I noticed new footprints in the soft dirt near the steps. Same boots, same direction, circling once, then heading toward the woods again. Whoever it was had come back. I loaded the truck fast, trying not to think about who had been walking around there or why. Right before I left, I took one last look at the cabin. It looked small and harmless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching from those trees the whole time. The forest was silent again, too silent. As I drove away down the dirt road, Cooper sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, ears still raised. I didn't relax until we hit the main road and the trees thinned out. The farther we got, the lighter I felt, like I was leaving something behind that had been following me without ever being seen. When I got home, I called one of the park rangers from Marlow just to report what I saw, the footprints, the sounds, the fabric. He told me, in a calm voice, that there had been reports of someone camping illegally in that area for weeks. A man who'd been breaking into old cabins for supplies. They hadn't caught him yet. That made everything click. The noises, the prints, the missing food I hadn't noticed until later. It wasn't something supernatural. It was just someone out there, living too close to where I was sleeping, moving through the woods at night while I sat inside with the fire burning. That thought scared me more than anything else could have, because it wasn't about ghosts or stories anymore. It was just real, unpredictable danger. I never went back to that cabin again. Sometimes, when I think about it, I picture the footprints behind the house, the fog rolling through the trees, and Cooper standing there growling into the dark. If I had stepped outside that night instead of staying in, I don't think I would have come back. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the noise of New York City and rent a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Maine. I was 32 at the time, worn down by my job in publishing and a recent breakup that left me restless and aimless. I found a listing online for a cabin tucked into the woods near a place called Milltown Lake, a small, almost forgotten area that boasted dense forests and an air so crisp it made the lungs ache in a good way. The cabin was old, built in the 1940s, made of weathered pine logs, and sat on the edge of the lake with only a narrow dirt road leading to it. Promised solitude and peace, and that was exactly what I thought I needed. The drive from the nearest town was long and winding, the kind of road that narrowed to single lanes and disappeared into thick groves of birch and maple trees. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the cabin. Its exterior was covered in moss, and the paint on the trim had chipped away decades ago. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and stepped onto the wooden porch. The air smelled of damp leaves and cold earth. I felt a strange thrill, the kind that comes from being completely alone in a place untouched by others. Inside, the cabin was musty, the kind of smell that clings to wood and never fully leaves. The furniture was sparse. A small table with 2 chairs, a rickety bed in the corner, a wood stove, and shelves lined with old, dusty books. I unpacked my things and tried to make the space feel a little more like mine. I lit the stove, the flames crackling and filling the room with warmth. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but inside, it was silent and still, apart from the occasional pop from the stove. The first night was the hardest. I had underestimated how dark the woods could get. There were no streetlights, no distant hum of traffic, just the sounds of the forest. Wind, the rustle of branches, and something else, faint but persistent. I told myself it was probably deer or raccoons, or maybe a porcupine, though it sounded too heavy for any of those. I tried to ignore it, but every time I closed my eyes, it seemed like the noises moved closer to the cabin. My imagination filled in details. A shadow crossing the window, footsteps in the dirt outside, the creak of the porch boards under a weight that wasn't mine. I told myself over and over, it's just the wind, it's just the wind. But it was a hard mantra to keep. The next morning, I explored the area. The lake was beautiful, surrounded by dense woods that reflected perfectly in the water. The road I had driven in on disappeared behind a hill, and the nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, maybe more. I noticed how the cabin seemed isolated in a way I hadn't expected. Isolation in pictures is one thing, but being there, surrounded by nothing but trees and the faint, cold smell of wet earth, was different. I felt exposed, not physically, but something deeper, the kind of vulnerability you feel when there's no one around for miles, no one to hear you scream or call for help. The days passed slowly. I spent most of my time walking through the woods, reading, and keeping the stove going. But at night, the noises started again. At first, I could dismiss them. The wind moving through the branches, maybe an animal. But the sounds became sharper, heavier. It wasn't just rustling. It was the sound of deliberate movement. Something scraping against the cabin, faint thuds on the roof, branches snapping as if someone or something was moving around me. I started locking the doors and windows, though I knew it wouldn't stop whatever it was if it really wanted in. I began sleeping with a small hatchet next to my bed, the weight of it in my hand somehow making me feel safer, even if just a little. On the fourth night, the sounds were worse. It wasn't just outside. I could hear something inside the cabin. Not a voice, nothing like that, but the floorboards creaking in the hallway, the cupboards rattling. I didn't want to leave the bed, but I couldn't fall asleep either. I lay there listening, heart pounding, every muscle tight, waiting. Then I heard it, a deliberate knock on the door. Not soft, not casual, but firm, as if someone wanted me to know they were there. My first instinct was to call the police, but I didn't have a reliable signal, and my cell barely worked in the area. I thought about running, but I had no car access without walking down the dirt road in the dark. My mind was racing. Whoever or whatever it was, they were out there waiting, and I had no idea why. I spent the next day preparing. I reinforced the doors with whatever furniture I could move, checked the windows, and made a makeshift alarm system using cans and string across the floor. I started thinking rationally, focusing on survival, on the reality that someone could be out there watching me. And then I found something, a footprint in the mud, just outside the cabin, large and heavy, like someone had been wearing boots. My stomach dropped. This wasn't an animal. This was a person. Someone had been here, and they weren't leaving. That night, I stayed awake entirely, sitting by the stove with the hatchet in hand. The noises came again, louder this time. Scratches along the side of the cabin, heavy breathing that I could almost feel through the walls. Then, at dawn, silence. The wind had stopped, and the woods were still. I opened the door cautiously and saw nothing, but the footprints were gone, and the mud around the cabin was disturbed, as if someone had circled and left. My relief was cautious. I wasn't safe yet, but I realized I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, leaving nothing behind, and walked to the main road, keeping my eyes on the tree line. After about 30 minutes, I saw headlights in the distance and ran toward them, waving my arms until the car slowed. It was a couple of local hunters. I told them I had been staying in the cabin and that something had been moving around it at night. They nodded, listened carefully, and warned me that occasionally, drifters or squatters wandered the forest, sometimes watching cabins for days before deciding what to do. I didn't stick around for details. I got in my car and drove as fast as I dared, the forest fading behind me, sunlight creeping over the hills. I never went back to that cabin, but the experience stuck with me. I kept thinking about those nights, about the fear that wasn't supernatural but terrifying all the same. You can prepare for a storm, for a bear, or for the cold, but you can't prepare for the feeling of being watched in complete isolation. And that's what I learned. Fear doesn't have to be a ghost or a legend. Sometimes it's very real, very human, and it's enough to make you respect the silence and emptiness of the world in ways you never imagined. Even now, decades later, I remember the smell of damp pine, the cold that seeped into my bones, and the sound of something scraping along the side of the cabin in the dead of night. And I'm grateful that I made it out, that I wasn't reckless, that I trusted the small voice of caution inside me. Solitude can be beautiful, but it can also be dangerous. And in those Maine woods, it was a lesson I'll never forget. It was late October of 1998 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin near the edge of a forgotten graveyard in northern Vermont. I was 29 then, tired of the city noise, the constant ringing of phones, and the weight of people around me. I needed quiet, real quiet, not the kind where you still hear traffic in the distance. The cabin belonged to an older man I'd met through a friend. He told me no one had used it in years, but it had running water and a working wood stove. That was enough for me. The road that led there wasn't really a road anymore. It was more like two deep tire ruts cutting through uneven ground, lined with old trees that bent low as if watching whoever passed. When I reached the cabin, the sky was turning orange. The graveyard lay behind a short wooden fence on the right, just 50 or 60 feet from the back of the cabin. It was small, maybe 20-30 graves at most. The tombstones were old and leaning, the engravings half-eaten by moss and time. I remember thinking how strange it was for anyone to build a cabin so close to a graveyard. But I wasn't there for comfort. I was there for quiet. The cabin itself looked tired but solid. The wood siding was gray, the porch steps soft from years of damp weather. The door stuck a bit when I pushed it open, and the smell hit me. A mix of dust, old pine, and something like wet stone. Inside, there was only what you'd expect. A small cot, a table, a few chairs, and the stove in the corner. No power, no signal, just a lantern and some matches left on the shelf. I unpacked my bag, lit the lantern, and listened to the silence. That kind of silence feels heavy, like the air itself has weight. That first night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, not from sounds, but from the feeling that I had heard something. A low rustling, maybe leaves shifting, maybe something brushing against the wall. Every time I opened my eyes, the lantern's faint light showed nothing out of place. Through the small window, I could see part of the graveyard fence and the tops of a few headstones. The light from the moon made them look like teeth jutting out of the earth. The next morning was cold and gray. I walked to the graveyard after making some coffee on the stove. The grass was wet with dew and the ground soft under my boots. Up close, the graves were in worse shape than they had looked from the window. Some had collapsed inward, others were cracked open, revealing dark, empty spaces where the wooden coffins would have been long gone. The names were hard to read, but the newest date I could make out was 1904. The wind moved through the trees with a hollow sound. There were crows perched on the fence, quiet but watching. I didn't stay long. By the second night, I started to notice things that didn't make sense. It began with the door. I was sure I had latched it before going to bed, but when I woke up around midnight, the cold air coming through the crack of it made me sit up. The door was open just enough to let the wind in. I shut it tight and pushed a chair against it before lying back down. But even then, sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old wood creak. In the morning, there were marks outside the door. Not footprints exactly, more like areas where the grass had been flattened in uneven shapes. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe deer or raccoons, and went on with my day. I tried reading, tried writing, but every time I looked up from the page, my eyes went to that graveyard. I didn't know why, but it felt like something about it had changed, though I couldn't point to what. Maybe it was the way the fog hung lower that day, sitting between the stones like smoke. That evening, I decided to sit on the porch as the light went down. The air was cold enough to make my breath visible. I sat there with a blanket around me, watching the graveyard until the last bit of sun disappeared. That's when I noticed movement. A small one, barely there, like a shift in the tall grass. I leaned forward, eyes straining. For a second, I thought I saw someone kneeling near the far end of the fence. But when I blinked, there was nothing, just grass swaying in the wind. Still, I couldn't shake it off. I locked the door that night, checked it twice, even moved the small table in front of it. The windows I shut tight too, but one of them didn't close all the way. The frame was warped. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint scraping sound, like something hard dragging over the wooden boards outside. I didn't move, just lay still and listened. The sound came again, slow and steady, circling around the cabin. I could hear it move from one wall to the next, sometimes stopping right below the window. I held my breath for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. When it finally stopped, I waited longer before getting up. I wanted to look out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I sat there in the dark until I saw the first light of morning. Outside, the dirt around the cabin was disturbed. Lines dragged across it, long and uneven, like something had been pulled. They started near the graveyard fence and stopped right under the back window. That's when I noticed one of the stones at the far corner of the graveyard had tipped over completely during the night. The ground beneath it looked disturbed, fresh even, like it had been dug up. The next few hours were the slowest of my life. Every creak of the cabin made my chest tighten. I kept glancing at my watch, counting the hours until it would be bright enough for me to leave. I packed up early, stuffing everything into my bag. I didn't even bother with breakfast. When I stepped outside, the fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The graveyard was a blur of gray shapes. As I walked past it to get to my truck, I noticed something new. A piece of old wood lying near the fence. It looked like part of a coffin, blackened and splintered. I didn't stop to look closer. The drive out of that place felt endless. The road seemed narrower, the trees closer. My hands were shaking so hard on the wheel I had to stop twice just to breathe. I didn't look in the rearview mirror once. I didn't want to see anything behind me. When I finally reached the main road and stopped at a small gas station, the man working there asked if I'd been staying near the old burial ground off Miller Creek. I nodded, not really wanting to talk, but he went on. He said the graveyard had been left alone for a reason. Back in the 1920s, there had been a series of shallow graves found near that same spot, all empty, like someone had dug them and then never used them. The land was sold cheap after that. Most people wouldn't go near it. I didn't stay in Vermont after that trip. I went back to the city, told myself I just needed the break and that I'd imagined half of what I saw. But sometimes, when I can't sleep, I think about that sound. The slow dragging across the wood, the open grave, the piece of coffin lying near the fence. I can almost feel that heavy silence again, the kind that presses against your skin and makes you listen for something you don't want to hear. And I still don't know what was out there that night, but I know it wasn't the wind. It was late September 2016 when I decided to drive up to the northern part of Maine to get away for a few days. I had been working long hours, and I wanted a quiet place. Somewhere without phone signal, without people, just trees and the sound of wind. I remembered an old property my uncle once mentioned when I was younger. It used to be a hunting cabin he and his friends built back in the 1970s. According to him, it had been abandoned for years after the roof started caving in. No one had been there for decades. That was exactly what I was looking for. Solitude. The drive took almost 6 hours from where I lived. The roads got narrower and rougher the deeper I went into the woods. By the time I reached the dirt trail that led to the cabin, my phone had lost all service. and my truck was coated in a thick layer of dust. The path was uneven, covered in fallen branches and overgrown grass. The further I drove, the quieter everything became. The only sounds were the slow crunching of gravel under my tires and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. When I finally saw the cabin, I slowed to a stop. It looked far worse than I expected. The wooden walls were gray from rot and weather, the front porch sagged under its own weight, and the windows were either broken or boarded up. The roof was missing several shingles, and the chimney leaned slightly to the right. Despite all that, I felt drawn to it. It had a strange kind of stillness to it, like time had stopped around it. I parked a few yards away and stepped out. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. My boots sank slightly into the damp soil. There were no footprints, no tire marks, nothing to suggest anyone had been here in years. I walked around the cabin first, just to see how bad it was. The backside was almost swallowed by thick bushes, and a tree had fallen across what looked like an old outhouse. Behind the cabin, there was a small clearing with a rusted metal barrel and the remains of a fire pit. Empty cans and glass bottles lay half buried in the dirt, probably from whoever last stayed here decades ago. When I pushed open the cabin door, it creaked loud enough to echo through the woods. The inside was dark and smelled of mold and damp wood. Dust floated in the thin rays of light slipping through the cracks in the walls. The floorboards groaned under my steps. There was an old table in the center of the room, 2 broken chairs, and a collapsed bed frame pushed against one wall. On a shelf above the table were a few rusty tin cans, an empty lantern, and a small jar filled with what looked like old nails. Everything was covered in dust thick enough to write on. I dropped my backpack on the floor and began clearing a small area where I could sleep. I had brought a sleeping bag, some food, and a flashlight. I wasn't planning to stay long, just a night or two. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own breathing echo off the walls. The woods outside barely made a sound, except for the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves in the wind. That night, I built a small fire outside the cabin using some dry branches I found nearby. I cooked a can of beans and sat by the fire as the sky turned black. The moonlight barely reached through the tall pines, and the temperature dropped fast. The air felt thick and heavy, and every sound seemed to carry too far. I tried not to think about how isolated I was. I eventually went inside, shut the door, and lay in my sleeping bag on the floor. For a while, I just listened. The wind moved through the trees, and the wood of the cabin made slow, shifting noises, like it was breathing. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight because I woke up to a dull thudding sound. It took me a second to realize it wasn't in my head. It was outside. It was a steady, heavy sound, like something bumping against wood. I stayed still, staring into the dark. My flashlight was next to me, and I reached for it slowly. When I turned it on, the beam caught the floating dust and lit up the inside of the cabin. The noise stopped. I waited, holding my breath. After a few seconds, it started again. Thump, thump, coming from the back of the cabin this time. It wasn't fast, just slow and deliberate. I forced myself to move, grabbed my jacket, and stepped toward the back window. The glass was broken, and when I shone the light outside, I couldn't see anything but trees. The sound stopped again, but I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt just below the window. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud, leading away from the cabin into the trees. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a bear brushing against the wall. But the prints looked more like boots than paws. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time the cabin creaked or the wind shifted, I found myself gripping the flashlight tighter. When morning came, I went outside to check the area. The ground was damp from dew, and I could see the footprints more clearly. They were human, leading from the tree line straight to the cabin, stopping right at the back wall, and then turning back into the woods. I followed them for a few yards, but they disappeared into the thick brush. The rest of the day, I couldn't relax. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. I didn't see anyone, but the woods had a strange stillness to them. Even the birds were quiet. I considered leaving, but I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe a hunter passed by during the night, saw the light of my fire, and decided to check it out. That made sense. By evening, I had convinced myself to stay one more night. I rebuilt the fire and sat outside again. The air was colder, and a layer of fog started to roll in through the trees. As the light faded, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small trail behind the cabin that looked man-made. It was narrow, winding between the trees, leading uphill. I hadn't noticed it yesterday because it was overgrown. I decided to check it out before it got dark. I followed it for maybe 50 yards until I reached what looked like another old structure. It was smaller than the cabin, half collapsed, with its roof caved in. I stepped closer and saw a few rusted metal tools scattered around, a broken shovel, and what looked like the remains of an animal trap. There was also a large wooden crate leaning against the wall. The top was missing, and inside were old glass jars filled with something cloudy. The smell coming from that area was awful, like rot mixed with oil and something else I couldn't name. I didn't stay long. As I walked back toward the cabin, I had the unsettling feeling that someone had been standing near that structure not long ago. The ground was disturbed, like something heavy had been dragged. That night, I barely slept again. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement outside, soft, slow footsteps circling the cabin. They stopped near the front door, then started again on the other side. I sat completely still, gripping a small hatchet I had brought with me. The door handle moved once, just enough to make the old metal squeak. I didn't move. After what felt like forever, the sounds faded into the woods. When daylight came, I packed everything. I didn't even bother to eat breakfast. I loaded my things into the truck and took one last look at the cabin. Something about it felt different now, like it wasn't just abandoned, it was being watched, guarded maybe. Before leaving, I walked once more behind the cabin. The footprints from last night were there again, fresh, deep, circling the building. I followed them for a short distance into the trees, and that's when I saw it. A small clearing I hadn't noticed before. In the middle of it, half covered in weeds, was a second cabin. Smaller but newer looking. Its door was wide open, and from where I stood, I could see a metal folding chair, a lantern, and a stack of empty food cans on the floor. Someone had been living there recently. That was all I needed to see. I turned around and walked straight back to my truck. As I drove away down that dirt trail, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. But there was nothing, just the same still woods, quiet and heavy with fog. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never told anyone about what happened, and I never went back. But sometimes when I think about that place, I remember the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps outside my cabin door, and I realized that whoever was out there had probably been watching that cabin for a long time, long before I ever showed up. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin I had rented in northern Montana. I was 31 at the time, and I had been working in construction for months without a single day off. The idea of being alone, away from traffic, phones, and people sounded perfect. I found the cabin through a small listing online. It looked rough, but it was cheap and came with acres of forested land around it. The ad mentioned that it was about 10 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by pine woods, with a stream running close by. It seemed like the quiet I needed. When I arrived, it was close to evening. The sky had that orange tint that comes before sunset, and the forest looked thick and endless on both sides of the dirt road. The cabin stood on a clearing, small, old, built with gray logs that looked like they had been standing there for decades. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch had soft boards that creaked under my boots. It wasn't much, but it had what I needed: a bed, a table, a wood stove, and enough space to clear my mind. There was a silence around the area that was heavier than I expected. No distant cars, no chainsaws, no voices. Just the faint sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird. I unloaded my truck, stacked some firewood inside, and filled a few jugs with water from the stream. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, felt fresh, even clean. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a can of chili on the stove, read a few pages from a paperback, and went to bed early. The wind picked up later that night, and I could hear it push against the cabin walls. The old logs popped here and there as they adjusted to the cold. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I slept well, though I woke up a few times because of the noise outside. Branches snapping, something moving through the leaves. Probably deer or raccoons, I thought. The next morning, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt beside the cabin, about 20 feet from the porch. At first I thought they were mine from the day before, but they were too long and narrow. Bare feet by the look of it. The prints weren't clear, but I could see where the toes had pressed into the soil. The ground was soft from last night's rain, so they couldn't have been old. They went around the side of the cabin and disappeared toward the woods. It bothered me, but I told myself someone might have been hiking nearby and got curious. There weren't any signs of damage or theft, and my truck was fine. I went about my day like normal, split some firewood, walked along the stream, and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the thought of those prints. The woods felt different after I saw them. I started noticing how quiet it really was. No sound of axes or engines, no houses nearby, no cell service. Just me, completely alone. That night, I made a small fire outside and sat by it for a while. The air dropped colder, and the flames lit up the area in front of the cabin, but the woods beyond stayed black and still. When I turned my headlamp toward the trees, I could see the reflection of moisture on branches, but nothing else. I stayed out there until my skin started to sting from the chill. Then I went inside. I bolted the door, though it was a weak lock that could be kicked in easily. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound that made my stomach tighten. A slow crunching of leaves and twigs just outside the cabin. I held still, listening. It wasn't an animal scurrying. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. I didn't move for a while, hoping it would stop, but it kept going, circling the cabin. I could hear it clearly, moving from one side to the next. Then silence. The quiet that followed was worse. I could hear the sound of my own breathing and the faint ticking of the stove as it cooled. I waited for a few minutes that felt like hours, then forced myself to get up and look through the small window near the door. It was pitch black outside, but when I leaned close enough, I thought I saw something move, a darker shape among the trees. It was too far to make out, and my flashlight beam couldn't reach that far. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the corner of the room, holding the hatchet I used for splitting wood. Every sound outside made me tense up. When morning finally came, I stepped out slowly. The ground was damp with dew, and there were more footprints. This time they were clearer, leading from the woods toward the cabin and back again. Bare feet. The prints came right up to the porch, stopping just a few feet from the door. I packed my things that morning, ready to leave, but when I tried starting my truck, the engine didn't turn over. The battery was fine. The headlights worked, but it just wouldn't start. I checked under the hood, and that's when I saw the problem. My spark plug wires had been pulled out neatly, not chewed or broken. Someone had done it by hand. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the wires, the prints, the silent woods around me. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched. Every direction I turned, it felt like someone was just beyond the tree line, waiting. I spent the next few hours trying to fix the truck. I had spare wires in the toolbox, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped things again and again. The sun moved low in the sky, and I knew I didn't want to be there another night. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore. I needed to leave even if I had to walk. I took my backpack, stuffed it with what I could carry, and started walking down the dirt road. The air was colder that day, and the wind felt heavy in the trees. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone. The woods looked endless, and with every turn the road seemed longer than I remembered. After maybe an hour of walking, I heard the crunch of footsteps again, behind me this time, faint but steady. I turned around, but no one was there. The road stretched empty, the air still. I picked up my pace, trying not to look back anymore. The sound came and went, as if whoever it was stopped when I did. By the time I saw the paved road ahead, my legs were burning. There was a gas station about 5 miles further down, and I made it there just before sunset. I called for help, got a tow truck, and went back the next morning with the driver. The strange thing was, when we reached the cabin, all the footprints were gone. The ground looked untouched, like no one had walked there in weeks. Even the wires I'd found pulled out were neatly reconnected. The truck started on the first try. The driver looked at me, waiting for me to say something, but I didn't. I just told him I was done with the place and that I'd leave the key inside. Before I left, I took one last look at the cabin. In daylight, it looked normal again, quiet, simple, nothing unusual. But I couldn't forget that feeling of being watched, the bare prints in the dirt, and the way someone had carefully messed with my truck in the middle of the night. I never found out who it was or why they were out there. Maybe it was a local living off the land, maybe someone squatting nearby, or maybe someone who didn't like strangers coming that deep into the woods. Whatever the reason, I knew I didn't belong there. When I got back home, I deleted the listing from my saved bookmarks and threw away the map that marked that spot. I haven't gone back to the woods since. Every time I drive through rural areas or see old cabins by the road, I think of that place. The quiet, the tracks, the sound of footsteps moving slowly around me in the dark. Some nights, even now, when I wake up and hear the house settling, I still listen for that same crunch of leaves outside the window. It never really leaves you, that kind of silence. It was late October of 2016 when I drove up to the hunting cabin my uncle had left behind after he passed. The cabin sat deep in the woods of northern Montana, about 6 miles off a dirt road that barely showed up on GPS. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was a teenager, but that old cabin had a strange pull to it. I guess part of me wanted to feel what he used to talk about, the quiet, the calm, the isolation. I was 30 now, tired of work, tired of traffic, and tired of people. I packed my rifle, some food, a lantern, and enough fuel to last the week. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. By the time I reached the last turnoff, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. The air was cold enough that it bit through the sleeves of my jacket when I stepped out of the truck. The cabin sat about half a mile from where the road ended, and the trail that led there was half swallowed by the forest. Branches scraped along the truck as I parked, and the silence that followed after the engine died was heavy, like the woods were waiting for me to move first. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and one of the shutters was hanging by a single rusted hinge. The place smelled like pine, old smoke, and damp wood. I found the key under the rock my uncle always kept near the steps. Inside, everything was just as I pictured it. Same narrow cot, same stone fireplace, same hunting knives hanging over the window. That night, I unpacked, lit the oil lamp, and sat for a long time just listening. The woods had a sound to them you can't find anywhere else. Branches creaking like bones, distant rustles from animals, the wind moaning through trees that hadn't been touched in decades. It was peaceful, but there was something uneasy about it too, like the forest didn't like to be disturbed after dark. I woke up once in the night to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, but sharp, like someone stepping on a stick and then stopping completely. My uncle used to say the woods were full of things that watched quietly, and I remembered those words while lying still, staring at the ceiling. I tried to ignore it and drifted back to sleep after what felt like an hour. The next morning, I went out to check for tracks, thinking maybe it was just a deer or a coyote. There were prints, but they weren't clear. The soil was dry, scattered with pine needles, but I could tell something had walked near the cabin. It was too large to be a rabbit, too light to be a bear. Maybe a stray dog, I told myself. I spent most of the day hiking toward a ridge about a mile north where my uncle and I used to hunt elk. The air was crisp, and the forest floor was soft under my boots. I found some old shell casings near the clearing. Must have been his. It made me think about how many times he must have sat right there waiting for something to move in the treeline. When I returned to the cabin, it was nearly dusk again. I noticed the door wasn't fully shut. I was sure I had latched it when I left, but I figured maybe the wood had warped or the wind pushed it open. Still, when I walked inside, something felt off. My backpack, which I'd left on the chair, was lying on the floor. The food I had left on the counter, 2 sealed cans and some jerky, was gone. There were no claw marks, no mess, nothing torn open, just gone. I looked under the cot, checked the corners, even stepped outside to see if maybe some animal had dragged it off, but there was nothing. The woods were still, too still, like even the birds were holding their breath. That night, I made sure to barricade the door with a chair. I kept the rifle next to the cot, loaded and ready. The sound of the wind outside seemed louder than before, scraping against the roof like fingers. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, measured, stopping whenever I held my breath to listen. By morning, I felt half dead from lack of sleep. I stepped outside to find the faint outline of tracks again, this time clearer. Human, barefoot. The toes were visible in the dirt near the porch. The prints led off into the woods and disappeared among the trees. My stomach turned cold. There was no reason for anyone to be out there barefoot in that weather. I followed them for maybe 200 yards before I stopped. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became, until I realized I couldn't even hear my own footsteps over the pounding of my heart. The tracks ended near an old stump. Nothing around, just the endless wall of trees. I turned back, uneasy and tense the whole way. That evening, I built a fire in the fireplace and sat with the rifle across my knees. The light from the flames threw long shadows on the walls. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow and heavy. I didn't move. They stopped right near the door. Then nothing, just silence. After a long stretch, I heard the soft creak of wood, like someone was pressing their weight against the door. I aimed the rifle but didn't fire. My finger hovered over the trigger until the sound faded and the night swallowed it whole. At sunrise, I checked again. More tracks. This time they circled the cabin completely. I packed my things. I told myself I was just being cautious, that maybe some hiker had lost their mind out here, but deep down I knew something was wrong. No sane person walks barefoot in the forest in late October. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I noticed movement at the edge of the trees. A shape standing still among the trunks, half hidden by the fog. I couldn't make out a face, just a lean frame, pale skin, and tangled hair. It didn't move, not even when I raised the rifle slightly. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, as I took one step toward the truck, the shape moved. Fast. like it melted backward into the woods. That was enough. I threw the rest of my things into the truck bed and drove. The road out was rough and the fog clung to the trees like smoke, but I didn't slow down. Every turn, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. When I finally hit the main road, I pulled over at a gas station 20 miles out. My hands were shaking when I filled the tank. The old man behind the counter asked if I'd been up near the ridge, and I nodded without thinking. He told me people stopped going up there years ago after a man went missing while camping alone. Said they never found his body, just his gear scattered near an old cabin. I didn't tell him I just spent 2 nights there. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I mailed the keys to my cousin and told him to do whatever he wanted with it. Sometimes, though, when I think back to those nights, I can still hear that soft crunch of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the walls like someone who already knew I was in there. It's been 9 years since that trip, and I still keep my rifle near the bed. Not because I'm scared of the woods. I'm scared of what walks quietly in them. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to spend a few weeks at my uncle's old farm in Nebraska. I was 31 back then, working long hours in a small-town mechanic shop, and I needed to get away from the noise and faces I saw every day. My uncle had passed away a year before, leaving behind a rundown farm and a small wooden cabin tucked at the far edge of his land. No one lived there anymore, and my aunt had moved to Lincoln. She told me the place needed someone to look after it for a while, maybe keep the weeds down and make sure no one broke in. I thought it would be peaceful. Just me, the wide fields, and some quiet nights under the stars. The first time I pulled up the dirt road, the tires kicked up thick dust that hung in the air like fog. The main farmhouse was closer to the road, but I kept driving past it until I reached the smaller cabin sitting on a slight hill overlooking a dry cornfield. It was about half a mile from any other structure, surrounded by waist-high grass and patches of wildflowers. The cabin was made of dark wood that had grayed from years of sun, the roof leaning slightly to one side. The windows were smudged and cloudy, and there was a faint smell of old hay and oil even from outside. When I opened the door, the air inside was heavy, like it hadn't moved in years. Dust floated in thin rays of light coming through the window. There was a single wooden table, 2 chairs, a cot with a thin mattress, and a shelf with a few cans of beans and peaches that had probably been there for years. I wiped the table down with a towel, swept the floor, and opened every window to let the air change. The cabin creaked with every step, but after a few hours, I started to settle into the silence. For the first 2 days, everything was calm. I spent my mornings walking the property, cutting weeds and checking the old barn about 200 yards from the cabin. The barn was huge, empty except for broken tools, some rotted hay bales, and an old tractor that hadn't moved in decades. A smell of rust and animal droppings hung inside, and whenever the wind blew, the tin roof would make a soft metallic clatter that echoed across the fields. At night, I sat outside on the small porch with a flashlight and a beer, watching the sky turn deep blue and then black. The silence out there was different. It wasn't peaceful the way I'd imagined. It was thick, heavy, and at times it felt like the whole field was listening. On the 3rd night, something woke me up. It was around 2 in the morning, and I heard what sounded like slow steps outside the cabin. Not footsteps on wood, but a soft crunch of dry grass. I stayed still, listening. The noise came from the side of the cabin, near the small window by the cot. I didn't move for a full minute. The steps came again, 2, then 3, and stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window, but the glass was so dirty that all I could see was my own reflection and a faint glimmer of the field beyond. I waited, listening to my own breathing. Then it went quiet. I tried to convince myself it was an animal. Coyotes or raccoons sometimes came close to human places, and I told myself that's what it had to be. But the next morning, when I stepped outside, I noticed the grass along the side of the cabin was flattened in a narrow line leading toward the barn. Not trampled, just pressed down like someone had walked the same path several times. I followed it halfway, but the farther I went, the more I felt watched. I turned back before reaching the barn. That afternoon, I fixed a few loose boards on the cabin's porch and kept my eyes on the barn. The sun set slower that day, stretching the shadows long across the fields. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I locked the door, closed the curtains, and lay on the cot listening to the wind push against the cabin walls. Around midnight, I heard it again, the soft crunching sound outside, slow and steady. It moved around the cabin this time. I held my breath as it passed the window, then stopped at the door. The old wood creaked under a bit of pressure, like something or someone was leaning against it. I stared at the doorknob, expecting it to turn. Didn't. After a while, the sound faded away, swallowed by the wind. The next morning, I noticed something new. The latch on the barn door was broken. It had been fine the day before. The wood around it was splintered, like someone had pried it open with a tool. I didn't go inside. I didn't even walk close. I just stood from a distance, staring at the wide dark gap where the door hung loose. I tried to shake it off again, telling myself maybe the wind had done it. The latch was old. Things break. But the uneasiness sat in my chest like a stone. On the fifth night, I decided to stay up. I sat by the window with my flashlight off, waiting. Around 1:30, I saw a faint movement near the barn. The moon was bright enough that night to see the outline of the field. Someone was standing there, halfway between the barn and the cabin. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow, but it was moving slowly, like it was trying to keep balance. The figure was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, wearing dark clothes that blended with the night. It didn't move toward the cabin right away. It just stood there for a long time, barely shifting. Then it began to walk, slowly, straight toward me. I didn't breathe. My chest felt locked. I grabbed the small knife I used for cutting rope and kept it in my hand, my fingers sweating. The steps came closer, one after another, until they stopped just a few feet from the door. Then came a sound that made my stomach twist, a faint dragging noise, like something being pulled through the dirt. I thought I heard a metallic clink, too. I stood frozen for minutes that felt like hours. Then nothing. No footsteps, no dragging, only wind. When morning came, I walked out, heart pounding, and saw something that made my mouth go dry. There were deep footprints leading from the barn to the porch, bare footprints, long and uneven, like whoever made them had been walking without shoes for miles. Next to them were marks in the dirt, thin lines where something metal had been dragged along. I followed them as far as I could until they disappeared into the weeds by the fence line. That was the morning I decided to leave. I packed everything into my truck, locked the cabin, and drove straight back to town. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to sound like I'd lost my mind. But 2 weeks later, I got a call from my aunt. She said one of the neighbors had gone up there to check the place and found the barn door wide open, the inside a mess. Old tools scattered, straw piles overturned, and something strange left on the floor. A set of dirty clothes, torn and stiff like they'd been left outside for months, but no sign of anyone. She asked if I'd noticed anything unusual when I was there. I told her no. I didn't want her worrying or asking more questions. But in truth, I think whoever or whatever it was had been living somewhere near that barn long before I came. Maybe someone who had lost their mind, or someone hiding from something. The footprints were real, the noises were real, and the broken latch wasn't the wind. I haven't been back since. Sometimes, late at night, I still picture that open field under the moonlight, the still figure standing halfway between the barn and the cabin, waiting. I know what I saw. There was no ghost, no creature, no trick of the dark. Just a person. Someone who had been out there too long, living in silence, watching from the weeds. And the thought that they might still be there, walking those same fields when the sun goes down, is what keeps me from ever setting foot on that farm again. It was early November of 2018 when I rented a small cabin in northern England, deep in the Lake District. I had taken some time off work after a rough few months and wanted quiet, far from people, phones, or noise. The place was small, old, and built from dark wood that looked soaked with years of rain. It sat by a narrow gravel road that wound through thick, wet trees. The man who owned it had told me it was an old shepherd's cabin, and used for years. When I got there, it smelled faintly of damp wood and something like smoke that had soaked into the walls long ago. The first few days were peaceful. It rained almost constantly, that soft, misty drizzle that never really stops. The roof made a steady sound all day, and sometimes the wind would push against the windows hard enough to make them rattle. I spent most of my time walking the trails nearby, reading, or chopping a bit of firewood out back. The place was isolated. From the front door, all you could see was the road disappearing into the woods. No other houses, no people. At night, it got pitch black outside, and when I turned off the lamps, the dark seemed almost heavy. On the fourth night, I noticed something odd. Around 9:30, I stepped outside for air. It wasn't raining for once, just cold and damp. The moonlight lit up the wet grass around the cabin. I stood near the steps, breathing in the cold air, when I caught a flicker of movement down the road. It was far, but clear enough to see that someone was walking. A woman. She was moving slowly, unsteady, her shoulders slumped. She wore what looked like a long coat, maybe gray or beige, hard to tell from the distance. She wasn't carrying a light, no phone screen or flashlight. I stood there for a few seconds, thinking maybe she was a local walking home from somewhere. But there was nothing around for miles. The nearest small village was about 6 kilometers away. I watched her for maybe 10 seconds before she seemed to stop walking. She just stood there in the middle of the road. I felt a strange unease, like something in my stomach turned cold. After a moment, I went back inside, locked the door, and tried not to think much about it. The next morning, the weather had turned foggy. You couldn't see more than 30 feet ahead. The road and the trees disappeared into thick, white mist. I stepped outside to get some firewood, and when I looked at the muddy patch near the road, I saw footprints. They were small, narrow, and deep enough that they had to be fresh from the night before. They led from the road up close to the side of my cabin, then turned back toward the woods. I followed them with my eyes as far as I could until they vanished into the fog. The thought that she might have walked up near my cabin while I was asleep made my skin crawl. That day, I didn't go anywhere. I stayed inside, made tea, read, and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling sitting in my chest. The fog stayed until evening, thick and silent. Even the birds had gone quiet. When night came, I built a small fire in the stove and tried to sleep early. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to the faint sound of something scraping lightly outside. It was a slow, irregular sound, like something brushing against the wooden wall of the cabin. I lay still, listening. The noise moved slowly along the wall, then stopped near the back corner. After a while, there was silence again. I didn't move, didn't breathe loudly. I stayed like that until I finally fell asleep sometime near dawn. In the morning, I went out to check. The ground behind the cabin was soft and muddy. I saw more footprints, small ones again, leading from the trees up to the back wall and then away. They were the same size as before. I felt a chill run through me that no amount of warm clothes could fix. I walked around the whole cabin, checking windows and the door. Everything looked fine, nothing broken. But the thought of someone walking around there in the dark while I slept alone made me feel sick. That afternoon, I decided I'd leave the next day. I'd had enough of solitude. I packed most of my things, filled the car with my bags, and only left what I needed for one more night. It was getting dark early, around 4:30 p.m., when the fog started creeping back again. The woods looked like shifting walls of pale smoke, and the road disappeared entirely. I sat inside by the window trying to read, but mostly just listening to the wind and the rain. At about 9 p.m., I heard a faint knock. It wasn't loud, just 2 slow knocks, like someone lightly tapping their knuckles against the wood. My heart started racing immediately. I froze. The sound didn't come again. I waited for maybe 5 minutes, then slowly stood up and went to the window, though I didn't get too close. I could barely see anything through the glass. The fog outside was so thick that even the front steps were a blur. I didn't see anyone, but then I noticed something faint in the gray. A figure, barely visible through the mist, standing near the road. She was there again. The same outline, the same long coat, standing completely still, facing my direction. I backed away from the window and turned off the lamp. My hands were shaking. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, just listening. After what felt like hours, I heard another sound. Footsteps on the gravel, slow, coming closer. Then they stopped. I didn't move. The only sound after that was the wind and rain. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep sitting upright, fully dressed. When I woke up, the sky was pale with early light. The fog was still there, but lighter now. I went outside carefully. The grass was wet and cold under my boots. Near the steps, there were fresh footprints again, smaller than mine, leading up to the door. They stopped just inches from it, turned around, and went back toward the road. I followed them until they vanished into the woods. I felt my stomach twist again, but I kept walking, maybe 50 meters down the road, where I saw something odd lying by the ditch, a long gray coat, soaking wet. I picked it up and dropped it almost immediately. It was stiff with mud and damp, and the inside was darkly stained, like it had been left out for weeks. That was enough for me. I went back, threw the rest of my things into the car, and left without looking back. The fog swallowed the road behind me as I drove. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped for fuel and told the station clerk there was someone walking the roads at night near the old cabins by the woods. He looked at me strangely and said that area had been empty for a long time. He mentioned that years ago, a woman had gone missing around those woods after a storm. No one ever found her. They'd searched for days, but the only thing they found was her coat near a ditch. I didn't say anything else. I just nodded and left. Even now, years later, I still remember that face I could barely see in the fog. I tell myself it was just someone lost or wandering, maybe looking for help. But deep down, I know how empty that area was, how far it was from anywhere. I still wake up sometimes hearing that light scraping sound on the wall, and I still see that figure standing in the fog, facing me, not moving. I never went back to that cabin again. I sold my things, moved south, and tried to forget it. But every time I drive through fog at night and see the pale outline of someone on the roadside, my heart stops for a second, and I can't help but glance twice, just to be sure it's not her, standing there in that same long coat, waiting, like she never left those woods.